The bills were Senate Bill 129, which was about creating a task force work group within the legislature on PTSD. Senate Bill 832, which was about adding veterans to the state of Oregon Workers' Compensation Preferred Worker Program. And the third one was Senate Bill 476. I'm sorry, that was the Preferred Worker Program. Senate Bill 832 is about providing grants to nonprofits for veteran services in rural areas. So the work group got together. We prepared some white papers that kind of talked about what the issues are, what the legislature really asked for, and the work group came up with some different recommendations. If you start on page 28, that's where the sort of describes what the work group did. John Howard, Dennis Guthrie, Tony Garcia, and Val Valfrey met on December 2nd, went over these issues and came up with the conclusions. So if you go to page 29, the work group recommendations for Senate Bill 129 on whether or not there should be a legislative task force, which is typically composed of a number of different people and quite a few legislators, should be put together to look at the treatment diagnosis of PTSD, sort of as a whole, but specifically for veterans. The work group recommendations, there were 3 of them. One was to do a contract for a study to find out what the real problem is, what the extent of the problem is, how many veterans in Oregon, what kinds of treatments are available, what's the access and utilization of those treatments, what are the federal, local kinds of treatments available, and whether or not people are getting the kind of help they need, but really to sort of frame how many veterans are impacted and what's the critical need. The second recommendation was to consider, after reviewing the study, then determine whether a task force is needed or whether to implement certain recommendations from the study. And then the third thing was to look at potential funding sources for such a study, because if you do one, you have to pay for it. And one of the things is that the Oregon Health Authority got $2.5 million in funds from the tobacco tax this year that are specifically dedicated to veterans. There's a possibility that Oregon Health Authority could fund such a study, and that would be available pretty quickly because they have the funds right now for this biennium. The second bill is, 27, 28. 832. Is rural Senate Bill 832. This particular bill said that should a grant program be put together to study grants for rural health or rural grants for health care for rural veterans. And the work group said, I'm sorry.
On page 32.
On page 32, there were 2 recommendations. One is that, as I told you before, we have this grant program that is going to be deployed in December. To wait until we have information on that grant program, what kinds of things were covered? Were a lot of rural areas covered? Were there a lot of healthcare issues addressed in that grant program? But just to take a little pause, see what were the results of that, and were there gaps in that grant program that may be better fulfilled? So then the last one was Senate Bill 476. There is a program under the Workers' Compensation Division called Preferred Worker. Preferred worker provides help for people who are employed in Oregon by Oregon employers who are injured on the job. The concept was, should veterans be added to the preferred worker program? As you know, if a veteran is injured on the job during military service, then they are eligible for a number of different kinds of benefits for that. The preferred worker program is a program that is only for Oregon employees of Oregon employers, because the way that that's funded is through workers' compensation insurance that they pay into this fund. In order to provide the same kinds of benefits and extend all that to veterans, it was going to cost, estimated from the Workers' Compensation Division, about $43 million for the first biennium. So the work group thought that there are a lot of other kinds of ways veterans get those services, and that that this was probably not an appropriate avenue at this time, and particularly because of the cost. So the work group came up with these recommendations, and what they have to do now is vote on whether to adopt the work group recommendations or do something different. So, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so